All right, so we can go ahead and get started. Mario, would you be able to share your screen?
Sure thing.
Okay, well, thank you everybody for joining us here today. As I said prior, my name is Robert Booth. I'm an engagement director here at Accelirate. And along with Mario Fortney, who will introduce himself in a moment, we have created and implemented this process discovery methodology and practice here at Accelirate. And what we're going to be going on is kind of piggybacking off of our previous workshop that Mario and I did together as it relates to our accelerated discovery program and what is the methodology that we followed. So we went over that on a high level in our previous call, and what the intent really of this particular call is to go a little bit more in depth on the standardized phase. So just to provide a quick recap, there's 4 phases that we have for our accelerated discovery program. We'll go over that. Sorry, Mario, I'll let you take on over that. But really the goal of this after is really establishing the vernacular, which is one of the key parts of the standardized phase. So Mario, you go ahead and take it away, and we can go from there.
Sure thing. So in their standardized phase, once a process architect, we walk into an organization and we're learning more about that department. We go through the initial exercise of understanding what is the purpose of this particular department, why do you exist, how are your people organized, how are you segmented, um, what are the implications of your group existing or not existing. And so, in doing all of that, we start to learn a lot about the company, its lingo, its acronyms, a lot of the different systems, the different processes, et cetera, et cetera. And so, what we have found that it is very important for us to establish the vernacular that we're going to use as we proceed forward with discovery, because oftentimes we find that people will refer to the same thing using different names. And so for us coming in, not knowing as much as, the subject matter experts, we could be, I guess, kind of chasing our tail or getting a little confused with the lingo, trying to keep up with everything. And so we try to go about a way to establish what is the terminology that we're going to use, how we're going to refer to things, how we're going to refer to processes, systems, et cetera, et cetera. I know in my experience, you may have a system, for example, that when it was first introduced to the company, it was called one thing. And then after so many new releases and updates, then it now morphed into a new name. And depending on who you're talking to and how long someone has been with the company, then the system may have a different name, or they may use a different name. They may refer to a process differently, et cetera, et cetera. So that whole establishing the vernacular is something that we find to be very important as we go forward through this methodology. And so one way that we go about doing it, of course, is we always start with an org chart that gives us an idea of how the org is structured, defines what are the employees' jobs, how are you organized, how are you set up. Some teams are set up to where we handle this geographic region and then you handle this other geographic region. Maybe teams are organized by types of customers that they deal with. Maybe you have, if you are, let's say, a utility provider or something like that, and you have your residential versus your commercial customers, and your processes are segmented based on those types of customers. So we go through that whole process of understanding the purpose of your organization, all of the roles, all the responsibilities, and we go through and define and name those things so that we can make sure that we're speaking the same language as we talk to our senior level leadership, as well as when we're talking down to the subject matter expert level. One simple example that we have here is that we could talk to a business leader and he say, yes, let's go to the customer service department. We have a lot of opportunities for automation there. Let's go there. And then we can speak to the process owner, maybe 1 or 2 levels down from their business leader, and then they would call it account management. And so we have to go through that whole process of understanding the jargon and settling on what the terminology would be as we move forward, so that when we are explaining to our stakeholders what do we see as automation opportunities, that we are speaking the same language both from the at both levels, both at the senior leadership level down to the subject matter expert level, so that we can meet in the middle and make sure that we're all in agreement on how we are referring to things, and what our real opportunities are. Um, and so here, I'm not sure what happened with the slide, but here is an example, and Robert can explain it pretty well because this is something that he's seen and working with the mortgage servicing industry. And so how we kind of go through and look at a department or an organization, and we use these terms to effectively explain how we define and set the boundaries of what is an organization, what is a department, so that we can get beyond the terminology of, oh, this is our strategic business unit, or this is our uh, department, or this is our division, et cetera, et cetera. So, RJ, I'll let you go ahead and explain this example that you put together.
Sure. Thanks, Mario. So now, one thing I want to kind of preface is you may be thinking to yourself, is it really that important for us to do this? And one of the things I always, kind of revert back to when explaining this to any stakeholder, anybody in the business, when they're kind of wondering, well, what's really the benefit of all this? Process discovery is difficult. I think we all can agree on that, and that's really the reasoning why this program has become so popular. Is just because it's something that we've been able to streamline and make a consistent value add to the customer. And just like anything, the devil is in the details. So the methodology that we're really following here, it's all encompassing in the sense that it'll allow us to be, in terms of being able to implement, it'll allow us to streamline that as we go forward. So this establishing the vernacular, you may say, well, I mean, we're really just saying, okay, what's a department, what's an organization, what's a process, so on and so forth, but it's doing something more than that. And if you guys remember from our previous session, we were talking about you have to adopt the automation mindset. And the reason why I say that is because if you really look in many areas, there's not many processes. There's a lot of tasks, but there's only a couple of main processes that any one department is really fundamentally doing. And our goal is really to identify those, right? And how the tasks that make up those processes, how do these correlate? How do they work? What's the up and downstream correlation? Because that is going to help us in contextualizing how this department or this organization functions. But before we can even get into that, we all have to be making sure that we're talking the same language. So the reason why I say establishing the vernacular is so important, it's simple, but it is very important, is because it sets a precedent that's going to be used not just for the one given engagement or the one department you're doing, but throughout your entire organization, where you'll better be able to classify what are the tasks and what are processes and what are the tasks that make those up. So let's just start from the top. So the organizational level. Now this one is where things can get a little bit gray, right? Because one of my clients, it's a very large company that owns multiple subsidiaries. So each of those subsidiaries I treat as an organization. So the definition you'll see on the left, an organization can be classified as an organized entity that is structured and managed to meet a need or to pursue collective goals through various departments that are either revenue generating or not. Now, the last sentence there, last part is the most important, the revenue generating or not. So is it a core department? Is this a core area, or is it a support? Because that's what departments are classified as, and I'll go into that in a moment. But what an organization really is it's self-sustaining. That's really the main purpose for, in some way or another, of how we classify as an organization. Because when you're going and you're doing your discovery, you want to make sure your scope is very clear. So you want to go usually by a departmental level. So you want to obviously go under one department that goes across, that is under one organizational umbrella. So let me give you an example on the right. So we have a mortgage servicing organization, which is one of the subsidiaries owned by this company that I am using as a reference. So the goal is really for this organization is to find mortgage solutions for customers that are looking for different programs, for different payment programs, for them to be able to actually have a mortgage loan. That's the overall goal, is really just to find mortgage solutions for customers, whether those customers is a brand new mortgage, a refinance, they are going into delinquency. It doesn't matter. This organization, the point of it is trying to find solutions for customers. That high level context right there really sets the stage for how far my umbrella goes, especially as you get into larger corporations that have very complex structures. If you break it down like this, it doesn't matter how large the corporation may get, it'll still all follow this structure. So the organization is really where we're casting our net, or we have our umbrella, but the departments are really where we're focusing on. So let's just start with, well, what is a department? So a department we classify as an area within an organization, and it's structured to meet a specific goal or set of goals for the overlying organization. So you're going to see that a lot, to satisfy a goal or set of goals. That's all any business, I don't want to get too theoretical here, but that's all any of these companies, it's the only reason why they exist, is because they're providing a benefit. And that benefit is provided through a series of goals that are met to provide a service or product. So that's really what a department is. It's an area within the overlying organization that helps accomplish a set of goals or a goal that is part of the overall organization. Now, these departments can be segregated on many different parameters. Depending on the industry as well, they may be very different. So you could have a product departmentalization. So Google will have its own line for maybe their Google Voice versus Google Drive. It could be a customer. It could be geography. There's many different departmentalization matrices. But for the example we're using here, the department, the most important thing to really consider as it relates to discovery is it a core department or is it a support? If it's a core department, that means it generates revenue. And if it's not a core department, that means it's supporting departments to generate revenue. And why that is at all relevant is because when you are looking at what the automation motivators are for a particular department with a stakeholder, if it is a revenue generating department and they don't have an idea of really where they want to go, it's pertinent to you for you to say, if you're revenue generating and we are able to increase your throughput, or we're able to decrease your overall cycle time, is that going to provide you some type of benefit? And normally the answer will always be yes. Support departments on the other side, they may care more about from a quality standpoint. So this is where we talk about our SLA, or compliance, especially in certain industries like banking, financial services, insurance. Regulation is very, very important. So in the department that you're in, if it's a support department, they may focus more on quality candidates than they would on, say, cost candidates. So an example of a department within the mortgage servicing organization is loan decisioning. So to tie it all back, the point of the organization is to find solutions for the customers. One of the solutions for the customers could be a refinancing, or a brand new mortgage, or it could be a workout program. However, that loan has to be decisioned. They have to look at a variety of parameters for them to determine, yes, they can afford that mortgage. So that is what the overall goal of the loan decisioning department is. It's really to review a borrower's eligibility for an alternative solution. Now, a department can be made up of functional areas. And the reason why I say can is because depending on the size, a department may not have any functional areas. It may just have one purpose. The larger your department gets, the more likely you are to have functional areas. So if you have a department of maybe 20, 25 people, you may not have any distinct areas. You may just have a couple of set processes that's all you do. And that's very common, specifically when it comes from a quality assurance perspective. There's usually not designated areas within that department because it's an inherently smaller team. And they just basically have a set of processes that they need to review, or cases they need to review for the overlying department. But what a functional area is really just a cluster of related processes that, when implemented collectively, they satisfy a goal or a set of goals required by the overlying department. So I hope you're starting to see the trend now of how each of these feed and work with one another. So an example of a functional area within my loan decisioning department is called documentation review. So I have a team of people who all they do is review documentation. They're reviewing borrower submitted documentation to see if they qualify for the alternative solution based on whether it is an income or a non-income related reason. Now, why that's important. The specifics of it are not, but what is important is to say is that the documentation review is just one area over the overlying department, and you may see certain resources that are 100% allocated to this area, or they are only partly allocated to that area. And why that's relevant is because depending on what the overlying stakeholder, so the department head wants, if they want pure cost reduction, then you want to make sure you're focusing on where are they 100% allocated to first. So all things to think about. So now we finally get into where everybody talks about process and tasks. So a process is just a collection of tasks, and they compile into an expected result or set of results, and we call this the output. So that process is required. Any process is really required for the overlying area, if relevant, and the overlying department to achieve its goals. So because the process is really what the task in a sense, but the process as well is really what's establishing the goals for the overall area and department, and then ultimately the organization. This is what we want to get to. But you need to understand, well, where do they fall under? Because there could be, I'm only have this process under this one area, or it may be interdepartmental, it may be inter-area. We don't know, but it's good to have that context of how they are able to correlate with one another. So, an example of a process within this area. So something that is being performed by some of the resources and that is in this department within the organization is called income review. So the goal of this process is to review a borrower's income to see if they qualify for the solutions that were outlined above. And how do they do this process? Is it a task? A task is just a group of keystrokes and logic that compile into an expected result or the output of that task that are for the overlying process to achieve its goals. So you'll see that they keep relying on one another. So MSP is just the system. One of the main tasks that they have to do in this process is raising a step, and that represents whether the borrower was qualified or not. So on the right-hand side, I just wanted to give you context of how these will all work with one another. Obviously, it can get a lot more complicated than this, but I do want to say that the purpose of outlining or relaying this to whatever your audience is because when they start thinking of it like this, they are then able to assist you in your discovery efforts. The best discovery projects are when you are working hand in hand or together with the business. You are not, and it's a very collaborative environment. So by making sure you're all on the same page and it's being broken down as such, it really just helps. It helps establish that precedent that can then be leveraged, for downstream benefit. So that's really the last slide. I believe, Mario, you tell me if I'm wrong, but so before we ask, we ask for the questions. One thing I want to say okay, well, you kind of gave me all this theoretical talk, so how do I put it into action, right? Preliminary documentation, and this is some of the things we'll talk about in our other workshops in terms of capturing the context and so on. But preliminary documentation is your friend, specifically when going into a discovery effort. So any preliminary docs that you can use, an organizational chart, organizational flow chart, SOPs, anything like that helps you with context is going to assist you in your discovery efforts. And we'll get into more of that in our next workshop. But just for now, one of the most important things that I personally use when I first start my discovery efforts is an org chart. It's one of the first things I get, because as long as it's relatively up to date within the last couple of months, and normally with many organizations, they do keep these up to date, you're able to then take that information and then you can figure out, well, how is it broken down just by the org chart? Because most ways organizations are clustered or are laid out is with that organizational breakdown in mind. They may not think of it that way, but you will start to see those patterns occur as you get into larger and larger organizations, that their org charts are going to be directly correlated with certain things that will help you in your discovery efforts, such as what are the most common variants. So if you have an organization or a department, let's say of 100 people, and you see 60 of them are in this one area, and then 10, 10, and 20 are in the 3 other areas, and let's say your motivator is going to be the biggest, their motivator for the client is really about cost reduction. I'm going to focus on that one area first with 60 people. And I want to know what is it that they are doing that is requiring such a large amount of resources versus the other 3, because more than likely those other 3 are going to be supporting that 60 person area or department. So just to kind of showcase how you can use an org chart to help with that in the interim before we go. Obviously, it's a little while to this next workshop. And hopefully that made sense. So it's 2:22 now. We have a good amount of people on. Does anybody have any questions, or Mario, is there anything else you want to add?
No, let's see if we have questions.
Okay, so we'll just go ahead and start with questions. And you could write in the chat as well as we have some submitted ones, I believe, that Megan has.
Yeah, there was one submitted. It says, how do you use this organizational breakdown for the subsequent phases?
I see. So this is kind of going into what we're going to be going as well into the capturing the context workshop, but how we use the organizational breakdown is very important when it comes to scoping. Because we do everything in iterations and waves. And again, we're speaking from a consulting perspective where we have fixed deliverables and fixed timelines. So what we use the organizational breakdown for from a consulting perspective is it allows us to, after we have already standardized, well, what are your motivators? What are you really wanting to get out of this? Then once we have the context of how the organization functions and how it's broken down, we're then able to make those adjustments that from an agile perspective of which departments or which areas do we want to focus on for this first wave, for the second wave, and so on. So we're consistently providing deliverables. So that's, if you guys remember from the first slide, we do continuous discovery. We want to make sure we're focusing on the highest value candidates or the highest value returns for our first initial wave, as it's obviously outlined from in our contract. So that's the consulting perspective. If this is somebody from the business side, how you would use that organizational breakdown, it honestly would be in the same way. Obviously, the timelines are really the only difference, right? But the organizational breakdown can be used for pretty much from any perspective, but how we use it for subsequent phases is really when it comes to categorizing and organizing the actual candidates. We're obviously going to want to focus on the highest impact areas first as it relates to the automation motivators that are standardized.
Yeah, and I think just to add to that as well, RJ, is that what it also allows you to do if you just take an organization at large, it allows you to kind of see once you start to deploy automations and all of that, you can kind of see where you are and what you've done and how you have tackled some percentage of this particular organization through RPA or through OCR and all of that. So it kind of gives you a way to plan out your roadmap for how we're going to prioritize our automations going forward. And then also another benefit would be that once you get down to that process and task list, so we use Automation Navigator to basically do our assessments on feasibility and complexity and savings calculations. And so by being able to scope it down to that level, then you can then set up your meetings with your different SMEs to talk about this particular process or this particular task. And then that way you can scope, it assists you in being able to ask the right questions about this particular aspect of a process or for this particular task so that it allows you to see what the benefit would be for just pursuing this one particular aspect. So the scoping of it is probably one of the biggest things too. And because I think the tendency is for people to, when they want to get started, people just come up with a list of tasks on a spreadsheet. Usually it's a list of things that are not high value. They're typically things that people kind of just want to automate away because they don't want to do anymore. And so you kind of can't see the forest because of the trees. And so by looking at it from at that macro level and starting to work your way down, you kind of have that whole perspective of what your automation opportunity could be, and how it would benefit your functional area at large, or any other departments who may be reliant on this particular automation. There could be ramifications for this automation, could impact other areas within that department, or across departments, et cetera, et cetera. So the more that you kind of have that broad bird's eye view, it kind of helps you understand the impact of what you're doing once you start your automation program.
No, that makes complete sense. That's a good point. Does anybody else have any other questions?
Yes, there was one more. They said, how much time does it usually take to do process discovery?
So, I mean, again, from our perspective, the accelerated discovery, it is dependent, of course, on the size of the department. But we work in anywhere from 4 to 8 week, sprints, if you will, basically, where we're able to do a department anywhere from 4 to 8 weeks, depending on the size. How long traditional process discovery can last, it could be significantly longer. I do also think it's fair to point out that it's also a continuous effort, right? As you gain more context, you're able to add more or identify and add more candidates. But from our point of view, from an accelerated discovery point of view, it is 4 to 8 weeks.
And that's also very critical to get participation from the business as well. So that 4 to 8 weeks is possible with walking in lockstep with the business to give you the time to conduct the interviews, ask all the questions, do process walkthroughs, providing you the documentation like the standard operating procedures or org charts or any other context that you can to review. All those things are important, and what allows us to be able to do it in a short amount of time.
Yep. Okay, well, if there's no more questions, it's 2:29. I really appreciate everybody jumping on and letting us present today. Look forward to our next workshop. Not sure if there's more you want to add there, Mario.
RJ, there is actually another question that just came in.
Mm-hmm.
They said, what all points need to be focused to make a successful discovery?
What all points need to? So what I'm going to say that what are the main points that need to be focused on for a successful discovery? It's kind of a long-winded answer, so I'm going to try and keep it as brief as possible. But if I had to say what are the most important from our methodology that you could apply, is definitely the standardization efforts. So understanding how the organization functions, then also having a set feasibility criteria in place from an automation perspective, as well as from a savings perspective, and being able to have that compiled list of candidates where you're able to apply those candidates on against that criteria. We use the automation navigator. You may have your own Excel model, so on and so forth. Those would be the main points that I would say for any successful discovery that they would need to have. But there's obviously many more that I'm not able to say in a short sentence.
Okay, cool. That looks like the last one for right now.
All right. Well, thank you very much, everybody. I hope you have a great rest of your week.
Amen. Thank you so much.
All right. Take care. Goodbye.